Good evening, everyone. How are y'all doing tonight?
Do you get any food?
Excellent. We're happy to see so many of you here. Some of you have come from the senior center, some from in town, and some of you are on the road, just pretty much on tour with the New Hampshire Humanities Council, but we're glad to have each and every one of you here tonight. I'd like to begin by introducing our speaker. Our speaker for the Humanities Council tonight is delivering a lecture that he's given for many years. Two women said that they have been waiting for years for the lecture to come somewhere within the area. So that is an amazing endorsement so far, but I've also heard a lot about our speaker himself. He is the chair of architectural history at UVA, which is fittingly one of the best examples of American architecture in the United States, designed almost in its entirety by Thomas Jefferson. And today, though, we're going to be hearing about something a little bit closer to home. Tonight's presentation, generously funded by the New Hampshire Humanities Council, is Victorian Architecture, Wild and Colorful. So, if you can please have a round of applause for our guest, Professor Richard Wilson.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right back there?
Not over here.
Not over there? Okay. Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah.
Is it better? Okay, I will try and use this. Can you see okay? You can certainly move up if you want to. Well, anyway, as was very generously noted, I teach at the University of Virginia, and let's see. Oh, Colin's going to run the images for me here. Anyway, I teach at the University of Virginia. This is a talk that I developed a number of years ago, and I tried to tailor it slightly to, depending on the spot where we are. But first, you may be wondering, let's have the next one, please. How it is that somebody from the University of Virginia, and that's it there on the right, the so-called lawn by Thomas Jefferson, how it is that I am here in Lebanon, New Hampshire. And the answer goes back to that I have spent, this is the 49th summer that I've spent coming to New Hampshire, to the little town of Gilmanton. Any of you ever been there? Only 1, 2, 3, 4, okay. The town of Gilmanton, there's actually several parts to Gilmanton, as there are with a number of New Hampshire towns, but this is the so-called corners with the Congregational Church and the Academy, or the old school. Go next, please. But the reason why I go there is that the lady on the right there is my wife, and her family had been coming up here for about 50-odd years. And so we have some property there, including this house on the right, which was actually a shaker-built house, and was moved to the site back in about 1855. Gilmanton, though, you all do know for another reason. We have next one, please. Next, please. And that is Peyton Place. Grace Metalius wrote Peyton Place right across the street from our house. Now, across the street from our house, actually, as some of you may know, this is the Brick House Antiques, which is one of the most substantial pieces of architecture in the area. But her house was down the street just a hair more, and that is where she wrote this, this novel of still some interest many years later. New Hampshire also has another claim for fame, and that is, any of you read this book, Devil in the White City?
Yes.
Devil in the White City by Eric Larson. It's a really wonderful book. It deals with the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago, which was a tremendous event architecturally and culturally in American history. But then he has a subplot in it, which is about a man who murders a number of different women. And his name that he was going by was Dr. Holmes, but he was actually, his real name was Herman Mudgett, and he was born in this house in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. And anyway, there's just something out of the newspapers at the time. It was quite an event then. And anyway, so that's another reason why Gilmanton is slightly known, is for this rather infamous person. We have the next, please. When I first started coming to New Hampshire 49 years ago, as many people are, I was very interested in the older architecture, the so-called colonial architecture, and roamed around taking a look at the different buildings. Over in Portsmouth, the famous Warner House is a wonderful, excellent example, very, very early in New Hampshire, even in New England, for such a substantial brick-built building. It's an indication of how Portsmouth was really a major, major port at that point in time. There hadn't been too much that had been moving inland, but Portsmouth was really a major port. And then elsewhere around the state, such as in Hollis, this is a small colonial house from about 1744, and another nice example. And while I was interested in these, I also began to notice this architecture, which it seemed to me really was not too much attention was being paid to. The architecture that is so-called Victorian. Both the houses, such as this house here in Laconia, which is a wonderful example, but also, of course, New Hampshire as an industrial state and the tremendous transformation that took place here, and some of the wonderful mills. They're scattered around different places, but of course Manchester in particular is well known. And here in Lebanon. The First Baptist Church, just around the corner a little bit, is an excellent example of what I would call Victorian architecture. The architects of it are apparently this firm of Mead and Mason, though they also were builders, and it's a little unclear as exactly who the designer on it was, but it's a wonderful example of Gothic Revival. Or if we go up to just a few miles up the road, to Hanover, this was the original, was an early library, not the first library, but an early library, about 18, I didn't get the date in there, but I think it's 1884 for Dartmouth College. And these are examples of this other architecture that say that really began to attract me and that I wanted to pay some attention to. We have the next, please. And elsewhere. As scattered around. Some of the remains of course, the transportation system that helped to make the state in the 19th century. Over in Potter Place, this is actually their historical society, now on the left. The great hotels, of which there is really only just a couple that are left in any sort of way. But here, the Mount Washington Hotel from right about 1900. Now, what I want to cover in my talk are four things. We have the next, please. And these things are, just another example here, what I want to talk about a little bit in my talk is four elements. First, the term Victorian and other terms and the dates and so forth that we're talking about. Secondly, to spend a few minutes, as I already mentioned, on the transformation that took place, but the economic, the social background that helped to produce all of this, and what this architecture represents. Then we're going to spend a little bit of time on the architects and the styles, and there is a myriad of those. And then at the end, to talk about the visual qualities. But the end, the visual qualities I hope we'll be leading up to, and I want you to pay attention as we go along. I'm not going to stop and explain every building, but such as this is just the Kimball House. It's where the Kimball Jenkins Art Academy is now located in Concord, but is a good example of what we sometimes call polychrome, multicolors, this sort of white streaks against the red. Sometimes it's called streaky bacon type of style. The elaborate types of details, such as this here on a railroad station that we'll be coming to. Next, please. Now, a couple of caveats about my talk. The first is I am not going to discuss interiors and furnishings. I'm sorry. If you're an antique collector, I'm not going to be your boy here tonight. That's another whole subject. I can come back and talk on that, but I just simply, there's not enough time to put all of the interiors and all of the wonderful furniture. If you have the next slide, please. Such as this is inside the house you're just looking at. The mantle, this is a detail. Incredible tile work that is around down here. But the point of this is that what we're talking about on the exterior does go to the interior. The second caveat is that I can't show every Victorian building in the state. We would be here for many, many hours, and I don't have, I'm afraid to say, images of actually every darn one. I do, though, want to say this, that every building with, I think, one or two exceptions are the buildings that are located here in New Hampshire. I'm not going to show anything that particularly comes from outside, with one exception, and you'll see, I hope what it means. We have the next one. Okay, the term Victorian that we use. The term Victorian goes back to good Queen Vicky, who ascended the throne. She was born in 1819, but she was only 18 years old when she became Queen of England. In 1837, she ascended the throne. This is a painting here, rather interesting. It's by an American painter, Thomas Sully. And he happened to be in London at that point in time and didn't get an audience with her and was able to do this painting. The term, though, Victorian, the way we use it today, doesn't really come into use until about the 1860s, the 1870s in England, when it becomes a reference to the political elements of the dominance of England. And you should keep in mind that at this point in time, England was the world power. The sun never set on the British Empire. That's an very old saying that we all know, and of course they did. They controlled a great deal of the world financially, industrially, and she was ahead of it. And it originally comes into use to say in this sort of a political type of meaning, and then later on gets adopted for literature, for painting, for the arts, and for architecture. But it certainly wasn't used then, that they didn't say, we're creating Victorian architecture. And I also ought to say that good Queen Vicky never designed any buildings that we know of. Though she did have her hand in a couple of important buildings in England. I'm not going to be able to go into them, but it is an interesting thing. But what it's come down to mean today, of course, is a multitude of things, but basically the sort of the architecture that takes place while Queen Victoria is on the throne until her death in 1901. Though in some cases we've extended it a little bit earlier, we started Victorian architecture a little bit earlier, and also we concluded a little bit later. So it's the architecture there. On another side, and I hope some of you recognize, this is one of the great American artists, though we just see him as a cartoonist, but the late Charles Adams. He was one of the great New Yorker cartoonists of all time. And of course, this is the Munsters right there. And they are about ready to boil boiling water on top of some carrots that are down below, as you can see. But of course, look at the architecture here. And this is what we mean by Victorian architecture. And this is what it's come to mean to some people. It's a sort of a cartoony, type of element. So this is where the term Victorian comes from. There are some other terms that are also used that I should put into play. And another term that is sometimes used is the Gilded Age. And of course that comes from, anybody read the book, The Gilded Age, by Mark Twain? One of you? Mark Twain, it's only us scholars probably that read this anymore. So it's actually a pretty damn good read as such. But Mark Twain and Charles W. Warner, and it was published originally in 1871. This is the 1873 edition here, the title page. And it is a tale of today. And what it is really all about, we have the next slide, please. It's about political corruption. It's about Washington, D.C., and about politics and so forth, and the corruption and so forth of different individuals. And the name Gilded Age sort of catches on to this period of time, especially after the Civil War, though in reality it goes back earlier. But I did want to put in these illustrations here just to show that there is also a connection between architecture, interiors, and the way that people dress. I mean, just look here. This is a ball taking place. But look at the type of a dress or that the lady is wearing, that the men are. And of course, this is a time of men with a lot of facial hair, some sort of expression like that. And so there's an overall visual type of connection here that I think keeps on. We have the next, please. Now, also, as part of these terminology that we use, we sometimes label buildings by so-called styles. And by styles, it means that this right here, this is the Greek Revival. This is a building about 1844. Actually, this is the house where Mary Baker Eddy grew up in Concord. But this is what we call Greek Revival. It sort of recalls Greek temples, or perhaps Roman. On the left, this is what's called Queen Anne architecture, and that is very much a reference to Queen Anne of England, though Queen Anne never knew a house like that whatsoever. But this is the type of labels that get associated, the type of labels and so forth that gets associated. We have the next, please. Or here, this is the Gothic Revival. I used the term Gothic Revival a little bit earlier with the Baptist church around the corner. This is a building here. This is the St. Paul's School, just outside of Concord. This is the chapel there. It was designed by a British architect by the name of Henry Vaughan, who came over to Boston and settled there and became very, very, very popular designing churches, especially Anglican or Episcopalian-related churches, all throughout New England. And that's what we would call Gothic Revival. Whereas this on the right, this is the New Hampshire Historical Society, right downtown Concord. And does anybody want to pick a style there? Greek, maybe, but it's a little more Frenchy classical. If you go to Paris, you will see some buildings that are not totally dissimilar to this. The architect of this, Guy Lowell, he's the same architect who did the main building for the MFA, the Massachusetts Fine Arts Museum, MFA, Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, but he is picking up on a French type of thing. And what I'm trying to say here, this is English, this is French, and I've just showed you some other things, that there is this wild diversity, this tremendous diversity of different sorts of styles that architects and their clients are picking on and using. And they are sort of clothing themselves in this. That here, very clearly, I think it was, well, we're looking back to the English prep school. Whereas here, well, this is France, is of course the World Center of Art in those years. Paris, the World Center of Art. That this has that type of look. We have next, please. Others, just to totally confuse you. Here on the left, this is what's called a bungalow. The term bungalow actually comes from India, and it is what the English imperialists, houses that they built over there. And it floats around the world, winds up in this country. The first use that we can find of it is about 1888 in the Boston area. And it then sort of catches on. And so this is a perfect example of what is called a bungalow type of style. On the right, as you see, this is in Newport, New Hampshire, down the road just a little bit. This is what is sometimes called Colonial Revival. And in this case here, these are architects, and this is McKim White, the preeminent American architectural firm at the time. They were the head of the pack, operated out of New York. This is what's called Colonial Revival. and they are supposedly looking back to earlier American colonial architecture. Well, no colonialists ever lived in a house like this. This is colonial on steroids, right? But this is what they were. This is what they were certainly looking at. So this is sort of an example of some of these terms and so forth that you find that throw through. Overall, it is Victorian. But then under this, you have these different categories and so forth. We have the next one. Now, the meaning of all of this. The meaning of all of this. John Ruskin. John Ruskin? Anybody recognize the name John Ruskin? He was probably the best read English writer in the 19th century. He was an intellectual. He specialized in art and in architecture. He published books such as The Seven Lamps of Architecture, The Stones of Venice, Modern Painters. And if you thought that you were in any way a slightly educated person in the mid and later 19th century, you read John Ruskin. He was a thing that was just demanded. His books were excerpted and so forth. There was Ruskin for young ladies, Ruskin for men. You go into any of the old libraries and you're going to find a pile of Ruskin books that are there. And what Ruskin said, and I quote, "All noble architecture is in some sort the embodiment of the life, history, polity, and religious faith of nations. All noble architecture is in some sort the embodiment of the life, history, polity, and religious faith of nations." Now, of course, this shows that he was, in his own way, very much an evangelist. But good people have good architecture, bad people have bad architecture. But architecture is an embodiment of who we are, what we are. Now, we don't want to carry this too far up to today. We won't go into today and so forth on it. But I think that this is certainly very much in the background. And the reason why I'm saying this is that buildings do represent values. The little Episcopal church there on the left, St. Stephen's in Pittsfield, and you contrast that here with, say, we go down to Enfield, or the Canterbury Shaker Village, down not too far from where I am. They're very different buildings. They do represent the values. They represent the values of the congregation that created this, which is a rather radical building for that point in time. These pointed type of arched windows and so forth, the tall steeples, the different color. This represents their values. This represents the values of the Shakers. Next one, please. Okay. Some figures. The population of New Hampshire in 1800 was 183,000. 183,000. In 1900, the 1900 census, I'm rounding this off here, was 411,000. So what you're talking about is in this century the growth a little bit more than double. The city of Manchester. The city of Manchester. You all know Manchester, right? You at least pass through there fast on the highway, if nothing else. The city of Manchester in 1810, depending on what you read, because there is a conflict in the census records for 1810, but the city of Manchester, or the area of Manchester, had a population of either 615 or 113. Depends on the exact area that you make, but you get the idea there. There weren't many people in Manchester. By 1850, the population had grown to 3,952. By 1900, the population of Manchester was 56,987. So you can add this up here, and you can see from a little bit less than 4,000, 50 years later, you've got nearly 57,000. So this is the type of growth. And that's what I'm pointing to when we talk about what happens. Because, of course, Manchester does become There are other places as well, but Manchester, for a period of time, is one of the prime industrial centers in this country for not only textiles, but for locomotives and a whole variety of other different sorts of production. And what you're looking at here, these are a couple of mills and so forth. This happens to be the Jefferson Mill, unbelievably. Thomas Jefferson was rolled his eyes at this because he did not like this sort of stuff at all. But of course, he'd been dead for a long time. But this is one of the reasons why we have this tremendous growth. Because architecture needs money. You don't get architecture without having money. We have the next please. What you do see as you do wander around the state, here we are over in Newmarket. This is a very different mills than we just looked at there in Manchester, and this shows the different, that there are more quarries that are over near the coast, and so they're able to build mills out of stone, out of masonry, whereas in Manchester it was out of brick. But you find these remnants. You find these remnants of this industrial past and the changes that take place. This building here on the left, you see it if you are buzzing through Concord, headed north, well, and south, but it's more evident as you're heading north. As you come into the city, this is sitting in your left hand, just up on top of the hill, and it's this round cylindrical structure. It is a very rare surviving example of a gasworks for the town. Almost all cities had gasworks like this. This is how gas was manufactured through the use of the offal and so forth from different animals and this type of thing. Most of them have been destroyed, but this is a very rare surviving example. But what I'm pointing to is that what in the 19th century takes place is this industrialization, that you have this tremendous change that takes place. You have all of this stuff being produced. Go to the next, please. The other change that takes place is it's not just an industrial revolution, it is a consumer revolution. You can't make this stuff without having somebody want to buy this stuff. And so there you have to get rid of it. And so this is a wonderful example here, and it can be found in a number of places. I just happened to pick this because it is so evident. This is on Main Street in Concord. This is the State Street block. And what we're looking at, this is a detail right in there. On the ground floor, this is all cast iron. This is cast iron that lifts up the building so that, ladies, as you walk along, you can look in and you can see the shoes that are for sale and you can see the dresses that are for sale. It's a way of displaying the goods. And this is cast iron. This is economic. Imagine if you were to have an individual carve each one of these different leaves, each one of these details, but you have new type of construction. You have cast iron construction that allows you to do this. Now, brick is still cheaper, and so you have the brick on the upper floors up above, but it's cast iron that's down below here, and it's a cast iron type of frame that's behind this. And of course, it opens it up and it allows you to look in. We have the next please. If you do look around, you can find cast iron used in not only there, but in a number of other places. One place that I like to haunt frequently is I like when I'm in towns to go visit their graveyards and so forth and to see the different types of tombstones and so forth that are there, and especially some of the enclosures for different families, plots, and so forth. And this happens to be in Hopkinton. These are pictures that my wife and I took now about 30-odd years ago when we were off exploring one day over there. As you can see, and this is rather interesting here, this is a sort of a very involved sort of a pattern here, and there's sort of a lyre or something like that is in the center. But I hope you can make out what this is. These are the sheep laying underneath the tree here in the gate. I was stunned when I saw this. As I say, it's about 32, 33 years ago that I was there. Of course, I took a picture too. Well, I went back 15 years later, gone. Totally gone. Totally gone. Where it went, who knows? But it has it's disappeared. But again, this is an example of these type of changes that are taking place, these type of changes, this industrialization and so forth. May I have the next? Another change, and a very, very important change here for New Hampshire, of course, is that we've become a summer resort. That it gains a tremendous reputation for some of the natural splendors, for the White Mountains. A lot of this is popularized in books such as there's The Dismal Pool, from a very, very famous book published in 1872, A Picturesque America, that went across the country, but interestingly enough, New Hampshire is right there at the lead. Or you get these paintings, such as here. This is Crawford Notch, the White Mountain, and this is where this very famous event took place, that these people were living in a house, and there was all of a sudden this huge landslide, and they ran out of their house. They were wiped out. Their house survived. They just stayed in their house, and it becomes one of these sites that people go to. An endless number of painters. Thomas Hill, a very, very important American painter, painted this scene, as you can see right here, in 1872, though the event took place about 35 years prior to this. But it is this attraction, we have the next please, of these different things, going up to stay at a hotel, or here, Winslow Homer, another one of the really great American artists in these years, and he paints a number and also does etchings. But here you are on the bridle path heading up Mount Washington with this lady on. So this is another reason why you begin to get this sort of attraction. Here, the next please. That you get these hotels that are built. Now, of the surviving hotels, the Mount Washington Hotel is really the premier example. Unfortunately, most of the other hotels have disappeared. And this is a very sad case right here. Again, these are photographs that I took, now, about 35 years ago, something like that, when I was out roaming around, and I came across this Upland Hotel. It was originally built in 1879, and then there were some additions put on it. This portion down here is 1879. This type of a roof is called a French mansard roof. Built in 1879, the additions were put on in 1887. And of course, the whole idea was that you would come up, you'd get away, you'd relax, you'd sit on the porch, you'd look out, you might take a bridle ride, something like that. You didn't play golf. Golf hadn't even entered in at that point in time, but it was a getaway. Well, sadly, it's gone. This is gone as well. That there are a lot of these buildings, and this is a major problem, have disappeared. We have the next one. Or here, also, of course, the lakes. Lake Winnipesaukee and the other lakes. Here is a view. This is from the Weirs on the left. The Weirs is a little bit different today. Just had motorcycle weekend a couple of weekends ago, and it's one of the centers for that. But the Weirs actually, and of course, there is where you get on your boat and go across from the Weirs over to Wolfeboro or to Tuftonboro or something like that, or you would come up by train. This is in Wolfeboro. This is the Wolfeboro Station. Again, this is a photograph I took a long time ago when there actually still was a train. This is more of a tourist train that was being operated there. And as you can see there, the two conductors waiting to greet you. Unfortunately, that is no longer. If you have the next, please. But there is the station today. And it's thank goodness it has been survived. The tracks used to come along on this side right here. And of course, now this is a parking lot. But you can see here, this has all of these features that we might call Victorian. A lot of different sorts of details, what's called sometimes gingerbread types of details. And of course, these are prime symbols. These were buildings that were very, very important to the people of the town. This is the way you entered the town. This is the way you left the town. These were prime symbols. Next, please. Just to show some that have disappeared. Meredith, a small station. This is the big station, and this was a major station located in Concord. And unfortunately, we have lost that. This is now where the bus terminal is located there on the spot. And the bus terminal, I should say, is nothing like what the station used to be like. We have the next, please. Of railroad stations in New Hampshire, this one right here is undoubtedly one of the best surviving examples, not just simply from New Hampshire, but actually nationwide. The architect here was from Boston. He did quite a bit of work for the Boston and Maine Railroad Company. This is where the excursion trains go out of today, but it's been beautifully preserved. That's a detail underneath right here in the corner. But notice these roofs on here. It was described back at the time that Mr. Bradley had chosen this style here from Russia, that it was a Russian style that he chose. Now, why Russian? Maybe it's because North Conway is a little bit like the steppes of Russia during the winter or something. But it is, if you have been to Russia and seen some Russian churches and so forth, those towers that are on there do have a certain similarity. But it's a good example, as I say, of this sort of exuberance of things. This is really a big thing to mark it up and to have and bringing you into town. We have the next, please. How did the ideas get up here? Yes, you can have architects who are brought up from Boston, and in time there will be architects who will be located in Manchester and Concord. But how is it that out in the hinterlands, people learned about architecture? And one way that they did was through pattern books. Pattern books were in the way of communicating ideas to the local builder, to the local lumber yard, and so forth. And there are a lot of these that were done. A tremendous number of pattern books were done in the 19th century, probably in the neighborhood of 2,000 different titles. Don't worry, I won't go through all of them with you. But this is a good example right here. On the left, this is the title, The American Builder's Companion, or A System of Architecture, particularly adapted to the present style of building. And then it has practical geometry, and he goes through all of these sorts of things. Notice Grecian architecture down here by Asher Benjamin, architect and carpenter. It's published in Boston in 1827. Going over this because Mr. Benjamin was originally from the Connecticut River Valley, and he is the first person that publishes an American pattern. In 1797, he publishes a book, The Builder's Companion, and that is the first one. And what you would get inside there, and this is from another pattern book, another guy, this fellow was down in New York, but he was very, very popular, Meredith Lefever, you would see your different sorts of details and so forth. So we have the next, please. So here we are, back into Concord, the house I showed a little bit ago. This is where Mary Baker Eddy grew up. And this is the front of it. And it's not exactly the same, but the detail here, this is a Greek Doric order that was on the front of this, comes right out of the book. It's not exact out of this, but this is where the idea comes from. And this is the way that people learned about these things. We have the next, please. Mr. Lefever has details in his book, shows you how to do a staircase, the different columns, and all of this, and then he'll give you a model of a house. And for right here, for instance, this is a front elevation of a country residence. And this is a pretty fancy thing right here. You've got the central block, you've got fluted columns, these are Ionic capitals that are located up there, you've got the wings on either side. Now, I'm not saying that on the right this is an exact duplicate of this, but if you ever are in Hillsborough, and instead of swinging around Hillsborough on the bypass today, but you go through downtown, you'll find these Dutton twin houses, and they have certain similarities. They have certain similarities to what Mr. Lefever was doing right there with their fluted columns. These were really pretty fancy houses. Now, if you couldn't afford this, we have the next, please. Lefever gives you a slightly cheaper version, and this is the more economical version. And instead of the fluted columns, you've got square piers that are on the front. That's a lot easier to build than to have fluted columns that are on the front of this. And so this is a slightly less expensive version right here of a country villa. And over the years, as I have floated around the state taking pictures, I've seen, this is over in Alton, not too far from where I am in Gilmanton, and of course it's a little bit decorated up here for the 4th of July, but this is basically, this is the square type of piers. We have the next, please. Or here, going up the east side of Lake Winnipesaukee, I found a whole bunch of houses that are similar. Now, I don't know, was there one builder that was doing all of these houses or not? I don't know, but it's rather interesting that you see this similar sort of a version that is scattered around in this particular area. And probably indicates that there is somebody there who's got a copy of this book and is putting out these ideas, and that there is a builder at least is doing it. Next, please. At a slightly reduced scale, the Greek Revival, you don't have to have full columns in the front. You can just sort of diminish it a little bit. But this is the Franklin Pierce house, or manse, in Concord. It is open to the public. And as you can see, Franklin Pierce couldn't quite afford the full front on this. But you do have these Greek sort of piers in the corner. And then this is into the doorway right here. Again, you have these piers, or in architectural terms, we call this a pilaster. Next. There are other books. I said I can show you all of them, but this is a very, very important book. Mr. Ajay Downing, he was from New York, Poughkeepsie, New York, and he caught on to this idea, and he began publishing books such as Cottage Residences, 1842, and he was totally opposed to what I've just been showing you, the Greek Revival. That was bad. What you ought to have is you have to have an architecture that is more located in nature. And he ran a big nursery. He ran a huge nursery up in Poughkeepsie. And that's really the way he's publishing these books, is to sell all of his plants. But the book's caught on. But he gives you a layout so that you got your house there. This is the layout. He shows you the way that you should do. There's your garden over there, but you should lay out your house with these curving, winding walks. And that the house should sort of fit into it. What he is doing here is say this isn't Greek Revival, this is Gothic Revival. He's looking at English cottage. We have the next, please. And you say, if you do look around the state, here's one down in Concord that's very much in the Walker residence. It's a North Main Street. Is very, very much in the A.J. Downing type of mode. This is another example out of his book right here. He likes these sort of pitched gables that are in the front. No longer the big columns or anything like that. The details, the pointy arched windows you see and so forth up here are very much Gothic. Next, please. Well, if you didn't like Gothic, okay, I'll give you this as well. And so he has a whole variety of different styles in his book. And this right here, this is a villa in the Italian style. And, well, here, this is in Nashua. You just flip this around a little bit here, but this is basically that house, sort of changed slightly, but it's basically that house right there. Of course, white isn't the color. Downing hated white. It should be some sort of a color that would be more like nature. And I should say on the color of white, white doesn't really come into New England in a big way until about the 1870s. And then you begin to get, because white paint was very expensive. And white paint becomes very cheap beginning in the 1870s, and that's when you begin to get what we think of today as the New England look of the White House, but that's really much more of a modern type of creation. A lot of these details that are in these houses aren't done by locals. They are mass-produced, and this is part of that Industrial Revolution. And there are books that are done, such as here, and you can see the title of this thing here. This is Mr. Bicknell out of New York, Detailed Cottage Constructive Architecture, containing 75 lithographed plates of a great variety of designs. And what he has is cornices and brackets and window caps and doors and piazzas, you name it. And this is what you get. this is what you get. You can pick what you want. And then you can go, this is from Chicago, but this is a millwork catalog of Mr. Robbins. And this is a plate out. These are different types of brackets you can put up underneath. And you can order your things here. These are the years that you're beginning to get. Unbelievably, mail order. Or this would be available at your local builder supply, your local lumber yard, and so forth. And you can pick out your things there. And so the consequence is, and again, this is another one of these books on the left, Modern Architecture Designs, page 8 of piazzas or porches. And, well, there you go, 6 different versions of porches. Now, I'm not saying that this porch comes directly from those, but all of these varieties really are coming out of these different sorts of books and so forth. Sure, and maybe in a couple cases there are people that are making them, but a lot of it is really part of mass production. Go next page. Okay, turning now to some of the architects and so forth that are here. One of the most important New Hampshire architects is a man whose work should be very, very familiar to you, because of course that is the church up on the green, just a few hundred feet from us right there on the right. His name is Ammi B. Young. And he starts out as a carpenter builder, but then he sort of gets going. And by the late 1820s, when he is really just 30 years old, he is constructing some of the main buildings at Dartmouth. This is his design there. This is one of several buildings that he did at Dartmouth. And from there, he is off to the races. And for instance, over in Gilman, where I'm from, Gilman. This was a theological seminary for Presbyterians that was constructed in Gilmanton, the Gilmanton Corners, after designs by him in 1838. It didn't work very well, and they finally went out of business as a theological seminary, and it became a hotel, and stood there and worked as a hotel up until 1893 or 4, don't quote me exactly on that date, when it burned and disappeared and is no longer there. But as you can see, this is Ammi Young's design for this theological seminary, and it's very, very, very close to the building we're looking at there on the left, up on the top, which is still standing up in Dartmouth. And he does other buildings, especially scattered around this part of the state. But what is really important about Young is he becomes the first architect of the United States Treasury. He's the first U.S. Treasury architect located in Washington, D.C. And the United States Treasury, up until the mid-1930s, was in charge of all federal building. All federal building, whether it's post offices, custom houses, courthouses, etc. It is under the domain of the architect of the United States Treasury. And he's the first architect of the United States Treasury. And the consequence of this is that this is the south front of the U.S. Treasury building, right next to the White House in Washington, D.C. That's his design. And there are in the neighborhood of 50 different buildings, such as this. This is in Portsmouth. I say there's one building that's not really here in the state, but this is over in Portsmouth. This is the old Customs House and Post Office in Portsmouth. This is done in this sort of an Italian Renaissance type of a style, but he is an extremely important figure. Next. In New Hampshire, there are sometimes claims made that there are buildings by a Boston architect by the name of H.H. Richardson. H.H. Richardson did Trinity Church in the Back Bay of Boston. He was the foremost American architect of the 1870s, 1880s. He passed away in 1886. But he invented this sort of very robust, what is sometimes called Richardson Romanesque style, this round arch, big, heavy stonework and this type of thing. And he sort of invented this and popularized it. And it crops up all over the country. I say he is a very, very popular architect with others. But there are no Richardson buildings designed by him in the state. What there are some very good examples, such as the Rollins Chapel, there at Dartmouth on the left, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. The railroad station there on the right is in Laconia. by Bradford Lee Gilbert. He did a lot of work for the Boston and Maine Company, and this is a very wonderful example of this Richardson Romanesque. Richardson's architecture is very heavy, big stone. You have a sense of weight. Anybody want to guess what H.H. Richardson looked like?
What?
Heavy. When he passed away in 1886, he weighed 310 pounds. Architects look like they're buildings. But I mean, he was this heavy individual. And I'm not saying all architects like that, but there is this sort of a similarity there, similarity with us. Another architects, I mentioned these guys before, the preeminent firm at the turn of the century was the New York firm of McKim, Mead, and White. Stanford White is the most popular person in the firm. You know why? He was shot on the roof garden of Madison Square Garden on June 17th, I think it is, 1906. What date? 25th? Okay, he was shot by the husband of a former lover. And it set off this huge yellow paper war and so forth about his scandalous behavior. There's been several movies have been done on this, novels done. E.L. Doctorow's novel, Ragtime, they did both the movie and the novel is very, very good. In the movie, Stanford White is played by Norman Mailer. You may know the American writer. But in any event, they did do some work here. The house on the right, which I've already showed you. And then a very close friend of both McKim, well, of all three, McKim, Mead, and White, was the American sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens. This is his studio over in Cornish. And that is a McKim, Mead, and White design. Next, please. Another architect, very, very prominent nationally, was a man by the name of Ralph Adams Cramp. And he was actually born in Dover, New Hampshire. His father was a Unitarian minister. Cramp ultimately became a high Episcopalian, sort of the alpha and the omega of religion. But Cramp becomes a very, very prominent American church architect in Boston. He publishes about 20 books dealing with religious architecture. And he does a number of buildings here in New Hampshire. This is no longer the Congregational Church of Exeter. Now Phillips Exeter has taken it over. But it's a wonderful example here in the interior of his architecture. Next, please. He did other things as well. This is the old public library in Nashua that he designed. It's not that any longer, but this is very much in this Gothic Revival type of mode. And Cram was extremely important, a really important national architect, but his origins, as say, go here to New Hampshire. Next. Now, turning to, I've been emphasizing some of the visual qualities as we go along here. But now to turn and look at some of these visual qualities of these buildings. Here you can see this is a church, Trinity Episcopal Church in Claremont. Claremont was a very, very prosperous town at one time, a manufacturing sort of a center. The church here is a rather interesting example of what Victorian comes to mean. And that is this plethora of visual excitement. The way that you get all of these different elements that are to it. And very frankly, if any of you are builders, you will know, you'll be looking at this thing and scratching your heads, why build it like this in New Hampshire when you've got snow and all of this? All of this frame that is on the exterior. But no, this is the way that it was built, because Frank Wills, who was the main architect on this, wanted to show off. And so what you're getting here is literally the frame of the building is being pushed to the outside, and that you have the clapboarding and so forth that is inside. So it is this sort of multiplication of details. And it's multiplication of details for some people that is really the characteristic of Victorian architecture. Next, please. This is an example here of what you should do if you have an old house to remodel. And this is Downing, Mr. Downing, I mentioned before, cottage residences, architecture, country houses. He had a partner by the name of Calvert Vaux, and it's how to remodel. And here's the old house that you've got. This is what you do to it, as you can see. You add a lot of things to it. You add turrets, you add chimneys, you add wings to it, you add details. This is the visual quality. In other words, when you look at this house here in Alton, can you really settle in any one thing? I mean, you know, it's just sort of a lot of stuff that is going on. Go next, please. Or here, in Pembroke. This is a house. On one level, it's a pretty staid composition. It is a free-bayed rectangular box. But then, well, you push the roof ahead, overhang, so that you get some brackets up there. You push out, of course, the piazza or the porch down here. You push out on the second floor up there so that you've got a gate, so that you have all of this stuff, that all of this type of gingerbread, all of these type of details. And then when you come up to it, and now I've stepped inside the porch right here, look up right there. Is this greeting you, or is it a guillotine that's sending you down? In other words, there is this physical element to these buildings, and that's one of the things that is either attractive or can be a little scary at times. Next, please. Here, I've always admired the Memorial Building, which is just around the corner. And it is, of course, on one level, it is pretty much a same color, though you do have the different colored foundation, and then the lintels for the windows and so forth are different on this. You do have a little bit of polychrome that is up here. This is a type of building that becomes very common in a lot of American cities in the 1880s, 1890s, during the century. They're the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic type of buildings. And of course, there's a wonderful, go back, a wonderful statue that is out in front. But especially, and it's worthwhile to go over and take a look at it. And you can see that there is this love of detail, the way that you have this window up here, and sort of this projects forward. As I already mentioned, the sort of polychrome there. Or look down here, and you can see that there is this rather incredible detail. Now, next to it. Or here, I mentioned this house before, but just to show it, this sort of streaky bacon, as it was sometimes called. It looks like something just taken out of your frying pan on a Sunday morning. But this polychrome, this tremendous contrast. Next, please. So it is details. It is details. It's details. And there is just a wealth of this type of thing that one can see. Next, please. Or here. That's Lebanon, around the corner, on the upper left there. This is from the Rollins Chapel up at Dartmouth. It is a love of detail, which in a certain way, we've lost. We've lost. The buildings aren't made with this type of detail, but much any longer. As I say, that they sometimes can speak to you in different ways. Here we are. This is up at Crawford Notch at the old railroad station there, which they have very, very beautifully and lovingly restored and taken care of. And there's an overall view. There is a detail there. Next, please. But look at this here. Or is the old man in the mountains? I don't know. But in other words, you can sometimes see, you can actually see faces. You can sometimes actually see things that are in them. Next. I mentioned a couple of times, and it's nearly over here, but just a couple of times, I mentioned a couple of times the problems of saving this type of buildings. And this is a major, major sort of an issue. A lot of them do disappear over time. They are some of the great, great treasures here in the state. On the left, This is in Kilton. This is the Winnisquam Mill. This was an extraordinary surviving example of a wooden mill. Most of the mills are brick or masonry. This was a wooden mill. There were a lot of these around, but of course, the problem is fire. But this building survived up until 4 years ago when summer I came up and I went over and drove through Tilton. It was no longer there. And I went and asked what happened. Oh, they just tore it down. That was it. That was the end of it. But I mean, it was one of the few surviving wooden mills left in New England, and it's gone. Or here, this is a folly that used to stand in the little park in Tilton. It's gone as well. The point is that there are some tremendous treasures that are out there. And this is something to admire, to look at, but also to keep in mind that this is part of our history. This is a very important part of our history, and is something that really ought to be said. Thank you very much.
Once again, thanks very much, Professor Wilson, for coming down to meet us tonight. I'm sure that some of you have a few questions for him, but while you're doing that, we do want to ask you to help us stay in the New Hampshire Humanities Council's good graces. We're going to be sending around a couple of really short surveys that take 1 minute to fill out. But if you'd like to fill those out, each one of you, well, Professor Wilson's been kind enough to do some question and answer for us. We really appreciate it. But thanks very much, and I will hand you back to our guest.
Yes.
Hi, one question. Queen Anne's style is part of the Victorian style, but what makes it a definitive style?
What makes the question is Queen Anne style, and as part of the Victorian, there is not, let me just say, there's not a Victorian style.
Right, because Victorian's a big...
That's sort of the overarching term, and then you've got all these different styles, even though sometimes people say, oh, that's Victorian style. It really isn't. What is Queen Anne was a style that was invented in England in the 1860s by a group of English architects who were trying to create a national English architecture. And so they went back to the time of good old Queen Anne and said, we're going to reproduce this architecture. And it pops up in England, London, etc. In the 1860s to 1870s, and then it sort of sails across the Atlantic over here. But what American Queen Anne architecture, if those Englishmen were alive and you come over and see what we call Queen Anne, they would shake their heads and say that you can always be sure that the Americans will get it wrong. But it comes over here, and one of the features of Queen Anne architecture, sometimes in buildings, are corner towers on it, such as I showed, shingles sometimes, or a little bit of half timbering, something like that.
Okay.
And that's what Queen Anne comes to mean in this country. But it's a very, very, in many cases, these are very, very loose terms that are used. Yes, sir.
The art and light architecture seems to be a fetish thing that changes every 20 or 25 years. I mean, before you realize it, we have the Bauhaus.
Yeah.
Well, what is the primary factors that make it sort of change? Because before you realize it, you had the Richardson and the great, I thought, wonderful architecture, and it was all over in 20 years.
Right. Well, the question is what causes change in architecture? And very frankly, bluntly, this is just my looking at it. There is a change of taste about every 20, 25 years. People just simply get tired of something and they shift to something else. So there's sort of a backwards and forwards type of a thing between complexity and simplicity, complexity and simplicity. I've done a chart for my students sometimes trying to show the way that these things visually do change. And you're very right. For instance, the Bauhaus and modernism are going to be coming in the 1920s or 1930s, especially in this country. And it's just simply a reflection of this sort of a waving type of change. The other thing is, of course, who's promoting it? And you've got to have somebody that's behind it. So it's the magazines, it's the books, this type of thing. Better Homes and Gardens, you name it. What are they promoting? And that helps out, certainly. And then, as I say, some things become old-fashioned. You know, that looks old-fashioned right there. I'm not going to do that any longer. I want something that's more up-to-date. And so you get this sort of this fluctuation that continues on. That's not to say that it's absolute on January 1st. Every 20 years it happens. It depends where you are in the United States. For instance, in the 19th century, some of these things keep on much longer out in the provinces, out west, than they do in the East Coast. It depends where you are. Yes,
I noticed in the Victorian houses that I see, they no longer replace the slate roofs, they just have them metal. And we still have a home on Long Island Sound, which is inspired by Downing. And we had to go through a great deal of trouble to replace that Vermont slate roof. And now it's on the National Register.
Good for you.
Yeah.
The question was, is that a replacement of parts and so forth, and a lot of these houses originally did have slate roofs
Yes,
on them.
yeah.
Or tin roofs. Tin roofs were the
Yeah.
other type of roof that was cheaper. Of course, replacing slate today is
Very expensive.
very expensive.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And the asphalt shingles have come in, and that's the standard. You do have some wooden shingles. Wooden shingles are not bad for a house, but you've got to get the right type of wooden shingle for it. But that's beautiful. No, it's very much of a Downing-esque.
Yeah, and I wonder, I don't see finials on any of these Victorian houses. And this house on the water had the original finial.
Yeah. No, finials, somebody pointed out,
Yeah,
yes.
I didn't see that.
Well, I think I had one or two, but...
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, the gingerbread, they removed a lot of the gingerbread.
Right, yeah. Well, that's the other thing, is that a lot of houses have the stuff taken off of them. Over the years, maintenance and so forth, well, it's just cheaper to get rid of them. So you
Yeah,
get the details taken out. Yes, ma'am.
There's a little short booklet in the Lebanon Library on architecture in the area, and in it, it says about my house that it is a fine example of Italianate architecture. Could you say what that might mean?
Well, Italianate architecture is
Way back.
there. This is
Yeah.
the Italian style. This is what is sometimes called Italianate architecture. And it reputedly comes from Italy. Now, Downing never visited Italy, but it reputedly comes from Italy. And a house not too dissimilar from this. You can see in certain landscape paintings by Claude or Poussin or certain European landscape painters, you will see some buildings that are vaguely similar to this. But what means Italianate, you don't necessarily have to have a tower, well, that's one of the things, but that you will have these spreading eaves on it, and you have big brackets underneath, and that's what sort of the generic Italianate stuff.
That I have, but not a tower.
Yeah, well, thank goodness you don't probably, because that's what do you use the tower for? But anyway. Yes, sir.
Another question. Residential architecture seems to be so flat more in the last 30, 40 years. Is that because of the developers or because of the architects? Is there anything innovative about American home architecture?
The question is, a lot of American residential architecture in the last 30, 40 years is pretty boring. I will agree. I blame it all on the developers. They're trying to find something that's packageable, sellable, and don't test test you too much.
Speed and cost.
I mean, there are some architects doing some interesting individual work, but one of the things that has happened since World War II is that less and less do you find architects designing houses for, quote, the middle class. They might design a house for a very wealthy type of a person, but other than that, architects are really sort of out of the business of doing this. There are some exceptions to this, and there are some people that do it, but it's gotten very expensive. And so it's just a lot cheaper to have a developer or the sort of pattern book type of a thing done. And that's simply what's happening. And there are, as I say, there are some interesting work that is being done that is more what I quote middle class, that maybe is affordable, but it's rare. It's rare. And it's, say, I blame it all on the developers.
Where did the Guggenheim fit in all of this?
The Guggenheim Museum, the one in New York City?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, the one in New York City is by Frank Lloyd Wright. And Frank Lloyd Wright comes at sort of the tail end of what I've been talking about here. He actually starts his work doing some work not too dissimilar to some of these buildings I've been showing you. But Frank Lloyd Wright is, any way you want to look at it, he is the best known, most famous American architect, and I would say worldwide, one of the best known architects in the world. The dates are 1867 to 1959. But what he developed was his own personal type of an architecture that was called the Prairie School, or the Prairie Style. But he had a very, very long career, a more than 70-year career, and during that time he changed. The Guggenheim Museum is virtually his last building. Actually, he passed away before the thing was completed in New York City. And what he was attempting to do in the Guggenheim is he had always been really irritated. He hadn't built a damn thing in New York. And, you know, if you don't play on Broadway, you haven't made it. You know, you've got to, and anyway, he'd been really, well, yeah, he did a Mercedes-Benz show, but that was it. That's the only damn thing he did in New York. And he finally got this chance for a building for the Guggenheim, a big collection of very abstract art originally. And the building is in total contradiction to everything else in New York City. I mean, it's this big circle that sort of is whipping down Fifth Avenue against all of these basically rectilinear buildings that surrounds it. And so he's just saying, boys, I arrived, I'm here. As he said, there's a very good TV interview of Frank Lloyd Wright with Hugh Downs about 3 or 4 years before Frank Lloyd Wright died. And in this interview, he says, better honest arrogance than false humility. And I think that sort of sums up. I mean, I happen to like the Guggenheim Museum. It's a horrible place to show art, let me say that. You remember the building more than you remember the art that you ever see in there. But it's yes.
I noticed a couple of examples in the architectural books. The printer and author referred to themselves as carpenter and architect. Was it common that there was some overlap between the designer and the builder, or was that just in a few cases?
No, I should have mentioned that. The idea of the solo architect that just designs things alone is basically an invention of the later 19th century. The first American School of Architecture is MIT, 1867. University of Illinois 2 or 3 years later. But basically there was no training of architects. And the architect, up to that point in time, and even after that, was very much involved in the building. They were involved in building, and they also did engineering as well. And what you do get is you get this sort of segregation of the different types of activities. For instance, the general contractor doesn't come in. It's the George Fuller Company. Is 1903 is the first general contractor. Now, there have been some around before that sort of been doing this, but up to that point in time, the architect is the person in charge of, to get somebody to do the foundations, to get somebody to cut the stone, somebody to put up the frame. Each of these were sort of different types of activities, and the architect was sort of overall in charge of this, and so that's where this builder thing is today, but that's totally gone out of fashion today. Yes, ma'am.
I just have a question. Right now they're talking about everything's green and they're using solar and all that, how will that affect our future in
Well, one thing is that this go green or environmentally, one place is to save old buildings, to reuse them. Don't tear them down and put up a new building, to
Right.
reuse the old buildings. It's a much more economical way of doing it than tearing the darn things down. And so that's the very first one, the very first thing in this. The second thing is that yes, this is affecting architecture in substantial ways. I teach in the School of Architecture, and it's a very big thing of designing this way. But it's more in the issue of materials than it is really in the look of a building or anything like that. It's really the materials is the one place where the green architectures come. Yes, solar panels and the roofs, but I mean, you don't see the roofs really that much and so forth. So.
No, I'm just curious about, like, if I have my children and my grandchildren in the future, what would they?
It's going to be.
I'm just curious if the design or different might change.
It's going to change to some degree. It is, but as I say, the impression that I get is that it is more in a technical area right now than it is in the overall design. But yes, it will in time do that. And one of the things is maybe to simplify things a little bit, but you can simplify them more. Everybody's done. Okay. All right.